Hey everybody, today I'm going to talk a little bit about suicide. No course in death, dying, and bereavement will be complete without some reference to the topic of suicidal behavior. I want to go over some of the most salient points in the research on suicide, the prevalence rates, cohort populations most at risk, and two of the most evidence-based prevention approaches in suicide. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death in the world. It's been estimated that about 800,000 people die every year from suicide. And by comparison, that's about twice the number as that from homicidal deaths. In the United States, around 600,000 people make unsuccessful attempts at taking their own lives, and we call that parasuicides. And by formal definition, suicide is defined as the act or the instance of taking one's own life voluntarily and intentionally. I want to, by way of introduction, show you this video compilation by the World Health Organization. It's about 2 minutes on those countries with the highest suicide rates. And if you're like me, you'll be rather surprised at those countries that are on this list, and also equally surprised as some countries you would imagine had huge suicide rates are not on the list. So check it out. So fascinating stuff. There's a lot of information on why those numbers are the way they are, what was going on in the country, et cetera, et cetera. But no time for that. I have a maximum 15 minutes to finish this. So in comprehending suicide, it's interesting to note that suicide is actually one of the most complex and least understood of all human behaviors there are. And a matter of fact, suicide is not really sad people who feel helpless and want to end their lives. That's probably not what suicide is. It's not even the most fundamental definition because research shows otherwise. It's very complicated, and we don't have a lot of the answers. We have a lot of the answers, but not all of them. Suicide is not classified, interestingly, as a mental disorder in the DSM-5. And you remember the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition. And it's a compilation of all the mental disorders, their etiology, their diagnostic criteria, and symptoms. And suicide's not part of that. But suicide is frequently linked to depression and mood disorders. And about half of all suicides, however, result from some other mental disorder, but maybe involve no clear mental disorder at all. So it's not just a result of people being severely depressed or having feelings of helplessness. Those are symptoms that are usually a part of suicidality, but they're not necessarily by themselves the cause. Suicidal behavior can be immediate or long-term, chronic, such as cigarette addiction, drug addiction, alcohol use disorders. There's 3 basic types: completed, the person actually was successful in ending their life; attempted, but not completed, such as parasuicides; and what we call suicidal ideation, in which there's recurrent thoughts and plans to take the person's life, but they don't do it. Probably the best explanatory theory of suicide is that put by Emil Durkheim, a social psychologist from some years back. And he reminded us that behaviors don't occur in isolation from the social systems they're a part. So whether your social system is the family, an ethnic group, a cultural group, the community, county, city, state, country, there's a social system that has great influence on the person's identity. And so behaviors never occur in isolation from those systems. So according to Durkheim, therefore, suicide is not an individualized act. It's caused by some power which is over and above the individual, the systems by which they identify with. Suicide is a result, Durkheim says, of social disorganization or lack of social integration or lack of social solidarity. And there's 4 subtypes, according to Durkheim. Altruistic suicide, of which there can be positive and negative forms. And that's where there's just too much integration into the norms and values of the social system the person's a part of. So bonds between groups are way too strong, and so individuals might sacrifice themselves for the betterment of the group. And a classic example is a combat soldier who jumps on a grenade in order to save others and yet in the process kills her. A negative form of altruistic suicide might be a suicide bomber. Then the second type is that egoistic suicide. It's kind of the opposite of altruistic suicide. And that's where there's too little integration into the norms and values of the social system the person's a part of. So bonds that unite groups weaken and the individuality increases, but the person's identity is with the system or the relationship they're a part of, not individualized. So an example would be after his wife divorced him and took their kids away from him, he committed suicide. And you can see in the box below there's some other examples of egoistic suicide. The third type of Durkheim's suicide subtype is anomic suicide. And that's where there's just too little regulation in society or within the social systems the person's a part of. And individuals are not regulated by the norms and values of the group or the societal order, because there isn't much, if any. An example, when an individual suffers extreme financial loss, the disappointment and stress could drive them towards committing suicide as a means of escape. They no longer can identify with the group they used to be in because they no longer have the means by which to reinforce that bonding and identification with the group. And then lastly, Durkheim says fatalistic suicide is kind of the opposite of anomic suicide, where there's just too much regulation. It's almost like a dictatorship. And norms of society, they're too oppressive and they stifle individuals. For an example, a woman who's stuck in a loveless, abusive marriage with an overbearing and controlling husband who decides to take her own life as the only means she sees to escape that. Mass suicide is an interesting event. It's usually multiple types of suicide, not just one. And we usually study, actually, a lot of meta-analyses research on the Jamestown Massacre or the Guyana cult, same thing. And accordingly, there was simultaneously suicide of members in the Jonestown community because they put the group above themselves, and by definition, it's altruistic, and where the motivation was related to a distorted evaluation of reality, usually imposed on them by the cult leader. But the far majority of deaths in Jonestown, according to the research, was they committed suicide for fatalistic reasons because the cult had become very hopeless, incredibly demeaning, and fiercely antagonistic environment. So how do we study suicide? It's hard to talk to people because if they completed suicide, they're difficult to get a hold of. But there's two other strategies used quite frequently to get information to understand suicide. And remember, the more information we can get through research, the more targeted and effective prevention can be created. So we study people who survived their own suicide attempts, the SOS group, survivors of suicide, and find out about what was going on, what their general demeanor was, the mental status, etc., etc. And also, or a retrospective analysis, which is kind of a psychological autopsy. And this is performed on alleged cases of suicide to know about the deceased at or near the time of death. I want to find out about the background, their habits, and their personality, mental status, and they usually use sources from their deceased's family, their friends, teachers, physicians, etc. Pattern statistics also help us understand the nature of suicide so we can develop more targeted and better prevention and intervention approaches. And interestingly, the gender differences are rather uncanny. Women, for example, have a higher attempt rate, parasuicide rate, about 3 times that of their male counterpart, whereas men have a much higher completion rate than women, about 4 times that of their female counterpart. And guns are used in nearly 2/3 of men in their suicides compared to about 40% of female suicides. Suicide also seems to vary according to race, and the suicide rate of white Americans is almost twice as high as that of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. And a major exception to this pattern is the huge suicide rate of Native Americans. Lifespan perspectives is that the older people get, the more at risk they might become if there are risk factors in their lives, and particularly elderly males by comparison. Just really, really, really high. Some of the major risk factors associated with suicide are prior attempts, substance use disorders, mental health conditions, serious financial problems, and social isolation. Warning signs. Remember, research shows that suicides generally don't just happen suddenly without warning. There's warning signs, verbally and behaviorally, and they precede the majority of suicides. So therefore, it's important to learn about these basic warning signs in an attempt to prevent the action from taking place. So there's talk. People basically talk about killing themselves, feeling hopeless, nowhere to turn, unbearable pain, and behaviors. Increased use of drugs and alcohol, withdrawing from activity, giving away prized possessions. And research shows that suicide risk can be reduced through education and learning new appropriate coping techniques. There's 2 that are really great. One's called SAVE, the Suicide Awareness Voices of Education, and the other one's QPR, Question, Persuade, and Refer. Check these out on Google. They're very fascinating. So how do you talk to someone who might be at risk? You hear some of the signs or they're talking. You want to talk to them in private. You want to listen to their story. Don't tell them yours. There's a few others on this list, but I want to get to calling the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at that number, 1-800-273-8255. And if they're willing to go, take them over to the Cabrillo Student Health Services or to an emergency room. That's it, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.